Good morning, everyone. We thought we'd start off this morning with a nice light subject like Syria to get your day going. I have the pleasure of sharing the stage this morning with Buck Sexton, the host of the nationally syndicated Buck Sexton Show on radio and podcast. His program is heard over 120 stations across the country. He's been a frequent guest host for Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity. He's also the co-host of Hill's Rising and a columnist for thehill.com as well. Formerly, Buck was a CIA analyst in the Counterterrorism Center and Office of Iraq Analysis and served in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's also worked for the NYPD Intelligence Division on counterterrorism cases. And to my immediate left is Marc, a former White House chief speechwriter, Fox News contributor, columnist at the Washington Post. He served as a member of the White House senior staff under President George W. Bush, where he was the lead writer on 2 State of the Union speeches, and before that, a speechwriter to Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. He was in the Pentagon when it was hit on 9/11, traveled 250,000 miles around the world with Rumsfeld, and he is the author of the CIA Terrorist Interrogation Program book called Courting Disaster. And he's a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute.
Great.
A little over 2 months ago, President Trump tweeted, "We were originally going to be there for 3 months," referring to Syria. And that was 7 years ago. When I became president, ISIS was going wild. Now ISIS is largely defeated, and other local countries, including Turkey, should be able to easily take care of whatever remains. We're coming home. Now, to get the conversation going, I'm going to start with a lightning round question. I just want you to answer in a yes or no. Did we accomplish what we set to accomplish in Syria? Marc?
We are accomplishing what we're setting out to do, but we're not done.
Yes or no, Marc?
Almost.
Buck?
Yes, we've accomplished the mission.
Marc, I'm going to come back to you because it seems like you're
sure.
not as resolute on your answer. You know, I think there was a lot of controversy in the last 7 or 8 years with our involvement in Syria. It's not just this moment of withdrawal. Our questions, and they were very, very valid questions, were what do we want out of the situation in Syria? Do we want Bashar al-Assad to stay? Do we want him to go? Are we there just for ISIS? Do you think there was ever a clear-cut goal or strategy in Syria, and what was that?
You're asking me. So yes, I think there is a clear-cut goal, which is to reverse the damaging effect of Barack Obama's precipitous withdrawal from Iraq, which allowed ISIS to recover. So let me start by taking it back with a story that explains a little bit of why I think why I support President Trump's decision to keep 400 troops in Syria, which he announced in the last week. When I was in the White House, President Bush called me into the Oval Office one day and said, "I want you to write a speech revealing the existence of the CIA's terrorist interrogation program." And he gave me access to, at the time, that was the single most classified covert operation in the United States government. I was given access to all of the intelligence that was produced by that program. And very importantly, I got to know the interrogators, Buck's colleagues at the CIA, who questioned Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and the people behind the 9/11 attacks, and got them to tell us their plans for new attacks. And I met the man who actually waterboarded Khalid Sheikh Mohammed. And after Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was waterboarded, he actually became a font of cooperation with our intelligence community. And he would actually sit, the guy who waterboarded him actually would sit in his cell between formal sessions and just talk and keep him company. And one day they were talking in his cell, and KSM was explaining to this CIA officer why it was that they were going to prevail. And he said that Americans have powerful weapons, but they have a weapon that's more powerful than anything we have, which is patience. And he said, and this is a quote from Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11, "We will win because Americans don't realize we do not need to defeat you militarily. We only need to fight long enough for you to defeat yourselves by quitting. That's the man who brought down the Twin Towers. And that was a prophetic statement because in 2011, Barack Obama made it come true. Barack Obama withdrew all of our forces from Iraq against the advice of all of his military commanders. At the time, they had controlled no territory, like they don't control territory in Syria today, and they had about 700 fighters under arms, according to John Brennan, who was CIA director at the time. And within a very short period of time, they went from 700 fighters to 40,000 fighters. They invaded Iraq and took over an area of Iraq and Syria the size of Great Britain. And they began focusing on external operations again. They spread out their murderous tentacles into 29 countries and carried out 149 attacks in places like London and Paris and Brussels that killed over 2,000 people and injured tens of thousands more. And so when Donald Trump came into office, he inherited this mess from Barack Obama, and he took the gloves off of our military and he unleashed them on ISIS and he drove them out of their caliphate. And he deserves credit for that. But ISIS is not defeated. They still have 30,000 fighters under arms because they didn't fight to the death in every one of those cities. And they stole $400 million from Iraqi banks, which they've invested throughout the Middle East. And so right now, thanks to Donald Trump, we have our boot back on the necks of the terrorists. If we take our boot off of their necks, they're going to regroup, reconstitute, and do exactly what they did when Barack Obama took his boot off their necks, and they're going to come after us here at home.
But
Okay.
to what end? I mean, you know, I hear this, and it's a very valid argument. But this is where we're going to get a little Jerry Springer for you all, because this is the point where I know Buck and Marc do not agree. The question I want to pose to you, Buck, is to what end? How do we define victory in a situation where over 400,000 people have died? It's produced 5 million refugees, 6 million have become displaced, and it does not look like there will be any stability in Syria in the near future. So to what end do we stay there? That instability will be a breeding ground for terrorism. So how do we define victory, and to what end do we stay there?
The mission set in Syria is straightforward: the destruction of the territorial caliphate that led to all the horrors that my friend and colleague here laid out for you. I would also offer to you that when you're going to try to end an endless war, there will be risks, there will be trade-offs. But the alternative is endless war. It was because of the 9/11 attacks when I was in college that I joined the Central Intelligence Agency. It was because of the 9/11 attacks that I found myself in Iraq and Afghanistan multiple times years later. How are those projects looking now, by the way? President Trump came into office because he understood that these are not things that are going the way we have been told they would go. In the case of Syria, if you look at a map right now of what's actually happening in Syria, you will see that this is a proxy war nightmare. The Russians, the Iranians, the Turks. There is, in fact, an area now that doesn't even get any news coverage, Idlib in northern Syria, where a group called, formerly the Nusra Group, now it's HTS, they keep changing the name, it's Al-Qaeda in Syria. We're not even focused on that area. It's effectively the Al-Qaeda affiliate. They've taken territory. And now there is a proxy war going on for that region. Never mind ISIS. We are not going to be out of this country for decades if we sit in place. Now, to the point about 400 troops, it was a few thousand troops. And those are the official troops, by the way. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Those are the official numbers in that country. We've drawn down to 400. This is heading in the right direction. President Trump is right on the strategy. The tactics he's been willing to talk to his advisors about and put it on a longer timeline out. But what do we think the end state is, to actually get to your question? The Assad regime isn't going anywhere. Iran isn't going anywhere. These other proxy war fighters in the region aren't leaving no matter what. We can work behind the scenes, we can work with allies, we can work with the Kurds. There's a lot that we can do without establishing a permanent military presence. Just look at a timeline of US troops in Iraq, in Afghanistan. These mission sets go up, they go down. It was over 100,000 under Obama in Afghanistan. Now it's down to less than 10,000. Have we made progress there? Is this a place where any of you would want to send your children to fight? I would not want to go back, because it's not a war we will win. It's a war that we can avoid losing, but that's not the same thing. We need to be honest about this. The foreign policy echo chamber in D.C. never changes its mind about anything because everyone wants to go to think tank meetings and sound smart. We cannot win these conflicts if you think that winning means rebuilding these countries for the people inside of them.
Yeah.
And so to your point about Syria and what we're doing there, I hope that we have no permanent U.S. military presence on the ground because I'm telling you, another emergency will come up, the Kurds and the Turks will be at each other's throats, something will happen, and all of a sudden, some of you perhaps in this audience or your sons and daughters are going to be walking around the streets of Idlib saying, what are we doing here again? Enough is enough. It has been decades already. We're done.
Yeah. So let me respond to that. So here's the thing. I understand that after 18 years of war, a lot of people are tired of war, and I get that. And people ask the question, when can we come home? And the answer is, in Buck's question, is that we don't get to decide when the war ends, because the enemy gets a vote, okay? So if we stop fighting and they don't, that's not good for America. So in traditional wars that we fought over our history, victory is pretty easy when you're fighting a traditional enemy to define. Victory is a signing ceremony on the USS Missouri when they take off their uniforms, turn over their arms, and sign a surrender document. ISIS is never going to sign a surrender document. Al-Qaeda is never going to sign a surrender document because they are, in Osama bin Laden's words, fighting a war of destiny between infidelity and Islam. So they are going to keep fighting. If we stop fighting and they keep fighting, we lose. We fulfill KSM's prophecy. So we don't get to choose when the war ends, but we do get a choice. We get to choose where it's fought. It can be fought over there, or it can be fought over here. It can be fought in the deserts of Syria and the mountains of Afghanistan, or it can be fought in the streets of New York and in the Pentagon where I was when the planes hit on September 11, 2001. That's the choice we get, and that's the only choice we get, and we got to keep fighting to make sure that those people never come back and commit an attack like they did on September 11, 2001 again.
I would offer that if that is, and that is the position that has been taken really in a bipartisan fashion now for a long time in D.C. Now we've had millions of veterans serve and come back. We need to set up permanent bases in Yemen, in Somalia, in Syria, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Pakistan, in the Philippines. How many places are we going to say, we need to fight them over there so they don't get us over here? At what point?
Wherever they are.
At what point? Well, I mean, we're gonna have to do a whole lot of military deployments for as long as all of us in this room are alive.
That's true.
What have we gained?
I want to push back on Marc for a
Sure.
minute here, because specifically, when we all can acknowledge that it is not a traditional enemy.
Yes.
But then we are employing the definition of the enemy dictating when the war is over. So our enemies will forever be in Syria, because they're not, when you have external factors in Syria, now to that point, when you have 400 troops remaining,
Yeah.
what would be your advice to the president in terms of how to go forward in this next chapter in Syria?
So here's the question that we get from people who hold Buck's side. It's like, why do we have to fight all these wars? Why can't they fight their own wars in these countries, right? Fair question. That's what we're doing in Syria, okay? So go back in history to the 1980s when one of our greatest presidents in American history, Ronald Reagan, came into office. And we were just at the end of the Vietnam era when we had deployed hundreds of thousands of troops to fight communism in Vietnam, and there was no hunger whatsoever in the American public for going out with massive deployments to fight wars in foreign countries. But Soviet communism was on the march. And so Ronald Reagan came up with a strategy called the Reagan Doctrine, which is that we are not going to go and send our troops everywhere to do the fighting. What we're going to do is we're going to send advisors and trainers to train indigenous forces to fight the communists in those countries. And so we armed the Nicaraguan Contras, and we armed the Angolan resistance, and we did this all over the world. What we're doing in Syria today is exactly the Reagan Doctrine. Our troops are not fighting, except for those CIA folks that Buck was referring to. The 2,000 troops that we have in Syria are not doing the fighting. Well, they are mostly special operations forces, they're artillery forces, and they're forward air controllers. What we've done is we've trained up Kurdish and Arab fighters who are the ones going out and doing the fighting. The American trainers plan their missions. They provide them with intelligence and targeting. They provide artillery and they provide air cover. And the Syrian indigenous forces are doing the fighting.
Buck,
that is exactly the right strategy.
I'm going to give you the last word.
Anybody who spent any time with indigenous forces and U.S. military embedded together will tell you that 400, which is the number we're talking about here, is really just a placeholder for a conflict the size of Syria. And the problem is that placeholder gets a lot larger. Remember, we were down to how many thousands in Afghanistan? Obama ramped it up to over 100,000, and to what end? Look at the troop deployment levels in Iraq. By the way, how long will we even be in Iraq? The most powerful politician in that country is Muqtada al-Sadr, who has the blood of U.S. servicemen on his hands. Some of you were in that war. You know exactly what I'm talking about. We don't have a long-term presence in Iraq. We should not try to have a long-term presence in Syria. All it takes is one incident one day. I mean, just to borrow from the point about Reagan and what Reagan was doing, we were on a peacekeeping mission in Lebanon. It's not talked about that often now. Multinational peacekeeping mission. Not a huge deployment of forces. We weren't the ones doing the fighting. We were just trying to keep the fighters apart. In Lebanon, right next door to Syria. In fact, many of the same factions that we see at each other's throats today. Many of the same groups. And then in one day, we lost almost 300 American servicemen because suicide bombers went after the Marine barracks in one day. And Reagan realized, you know what? This is a hornet's nest. We are not going to win this fight, and it's not our fight, and we left. That is another lesson of Reagan's that you should not forget.
And Osama bin Laden cited the U.S. withdrawal from Beirut as reason why he attacked us on 9/11, because he said the Americans are weak and decadent, don't have the stomach for the fight, and they will withdraw from if we attack them. Okay. So that decision actually helped lead to the 9/11 attacks.
Unfortunately, we have to leave the conversation there. I hope we've solved the problem in Syria for you in about 20 minutes.
That's fun, man.
Thank you. Have a wonderful rest of the day. And thank you to you both, wonderful panelists.
Thanks.
Thank you.